what are the important changes taking place in the global framework? The President of Cote d'Ivoire referred to the framework that was put in place after World War II and the changes that the economic framework put in place after World War II and the changes taking place in it right now. In that context, how should we think of the one-time global dominance of the United States? Is it still possible for the world to operate as well as we now think it did when we thought in the past it wasn't doing so well without American leadership? What difference, if it is your view that the Pax Americana is weakening, what difference does that make? And how will the rise of Asia change the global economic and financial architecture? But those are framework questions, and Richard, please respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. It's like one of those radio shows. In 7 minutes, we'll give you the world. You describe me as a political scientist and others as economists, but universities may be divided along departmental lines. The world isn't. And in every sense, I think one has to approach it from both perspectives. Let me just start out with a number of trends, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I think the consequences are. The first is the basic diffusion of power. What's so interesting about the 21st century, now about a decade old, is how power is getting redistributed. And it's moving away from a high concentration in the hands of the United States, or what you might call the OECD world, and is spreading much more broadly. And consistent with that, a second point, it's not simply states who are the players. One of the interesting phenomena of this moment of history is the rise of actors other than states who can command considerable power and at times exert considerable influence. All of this takes place against the backdrop of globalization, essentially the enormous flows that are both vast and fast are virtually everything imaginable, from computer viruses to real viruses, to people, to guns, to dollars, to euros, you name it, across borders in ways that governments can't control in many cases, and indeed in many ways governments can't even monitor. In this world, the United States is still first, not so much among equals, but first among unequals. But the United States faces its own significant domestic challenges. And there's various ways in which the world can push back against American influence. That said, American strengths are considerable. Just to mention one that's gone largely overlooked of late is the revolution in American energy. We have gone from imagining ourselves as a major importer of natural gas. Now there's a big debate about whether we should become a significant exporter. Our oil production has gone up dramatically, and all of this essentially has happened literally and figuratively beneath the surface. Europe, however, does not have such a happy story to say. Martin will speak about it with great authority. But I'd say one of the differences between the 20th century and the 21st century is whereas Europe was the central theater of much of 20th century history, it is unlikely to be for the 21st century. That's not necessarily bad. At times, Europe was all too interesting in the 20th century, and the idea of a Europe that's slightly less interesting is something that should be welcomed by us all. But it also means that Europe will be less willing and able to be a partner of the United States or anyone else in trying to tame what essentially is a world that is often challenged by globalization. Much the same could be said about Japan, now beginning, if you will, its third decade of drift with little or no end in sight. Russia is only a superpower in the sense that it has nuclear weapons, vast oil reserves, and a seat on the UN Security Council. Other than that, it is mainly characterized by a shrinking demography and increasingly by a political system that is out of sync with the Russian people. China is often seen as the rising power. I would simply say that it's often dangerous to simply extrapolate, and I would suggest that the experience of the last 3 decades, if you will, the Deng Xiaoping era of China, is not likely to be continued without interruption over the next 3 decades. Indeed, the question of how China fares with its internal challenges could turn out to be one of the great questions not simply of our time, but of the immediate future. Asia as a whole has done rather well. And indeed, one of the interesting positive things in the world is that you've had so much economic dynamism that has not spilled over. The circuits, if you will, the political circuits of Asia have done quite well at contending with the degree of dynamism. The president of Cote d'Ivoire spoke about Africa. Africa is also increasingly one of the success stories in the world, and I'd say the same but even stronger about Latin America. If we'd been having this meeting 2 decades ago, and anyone had described the Latin America of today, largely at peace, largely democratic, largely market-oriented, people would have said, that's great, but it's unrealistic. Well, this is now a reality. And I would dare suggest that 10 years from now, Cuba and Venezuela are much more likely to look like the rest of Latin America than vice versa. There are, however, some other disappointments to that. I would add India, which is unlikely to be in a position to sustain its growth of recent years. There's a rise of nationalism in the world. Indeed, one of the phenomena we're seeing in Europe is the resilience of nationalism against regional institutions. And last but not least, this part of the world, the Middle East, which has largely missed out on modernization, has largely missed out on the democratic and market revolutions that have characterized this era. And I would simply say it's far too soon to assume that the radical changes we are seeing will end up happily. I never much cared for the phrase Arab Spring. Spring lasts 3 months. 3 decades is probably a more useful time frame to approach these changes. And I hope they end up spring-like, but I don't think anyone can assume. What then does all this add up to? I would just suggest a few things. One is a 21st century that's fundamentally different than the 20th century, where great power, competition, and conflict is not necessarily at the center of international relations. Secondly, in this context, where rather than great powers, weak states and medium powers may be far more significant for how history unfolds. Looking at the next couple of years, for example, it's the medium powers of Iran and North Korea who pose the real threat to regional and through that to international order. Stanley asked about the global framework. What's so interesting is how global institutions have, for the most part, failed to keep up with many of the changes I've discussed. Global institutions that we live with were largely created in the aftermath of World War II. They changed, but not nearly enough, either to keep up with the phenomenon of globalization on one hand, or with the redistribution of political, economic, and military power on the other. There's, if you will, a global gap between institutional arrangements and geopolitical and geoeconomic realities. 2 last points, and I'll stop. One is that there's no alternative to U.S. influence in this world, but there are questions about whether the U.S. political system is up to the challenges of the United States maintaining its leadership position. The United States has an extraordinary range and number of innate strengths. And again, the real question to me is whether the polarization that we've seen of late will essentially resolve itself sufficiently so these strengths can come to the fore. And I hope so, because I don't see anybody else willing and able to take the place of the United States. Other countries don't have the capabilities. More important, they don't have the outlook and they don't have the habits of leadership. So the alternative to American leadership that succeeds is not the leadership of someone else, but it's essentially a world that would have to get along without leadership, and that would be a world that would be far less orderly, far less peaceful, far less free, and far less prosperous.
Thanks very much indeed, Richard, and that was terrific. The next speaker is Alan Bollard, who's the Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. For those of you who are interested in central banking, which is probably a minority of the audience, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has been an intellectual pioneer in the development of monetary policy. They were the first to adopt the inflation targeting approach to monetary policy, which is now used by many central banks. They've done a variety of very interesting things. We won't ask Alan to focus on central banking, although I will ask him, as he's now drawing to the end of his 10 years in office, to tell us what are the three most important lessons he's learned from these 10 years. Alan, you're obviously heavily affected by what's happening around you, by China in particular, by other countries. You're also heavily affected by Asia. How do you see developments in Asia, by Australia, I meant. How do you see developments in Asia, particularly developments in China, from here on out, and how do you see their influence on your region? And if you want to venture a word on political influences, that would also be very interesting. And thank you very much, like everyone else who's on this panel, for coming to participate in it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, excuse me, thank you, Stanley. The audience may not know that in the world of central banking, if you get a phone call from Stan Fisher inviting you to a cozy little conference, you don't turn it down. You go out and buy your plane ticket, even if it's going to take you 30 hours to get here. 30 hours. Because we are a long way away. And as the British poet Rudyard Kipling said when he visited New Zealand, he wrote a poem that started off, "Last, loneliest, loveliest," which should really mean it's a good place to ride out a global financial crisis. But at the nadir of the Lehman's crisis and workout by the American administration, the place where the markets first confronted that was the first market to open in the world, and that was in New Zealand, and it wasn't a very happy time in September 2008. And the lesson out of that is you can run, but you can't hide. Globalization means that in our part of the world, you've got about 30 seconds before the bad news hits these days. And when the global financial crisis turned into a global economic crisis, we felt that. And of course, since then, it's turned into a global sovereign debt crisis. And like the rest of the world, we're all fighting to ensure that we don't fall into that trap as well. The conference is about the world tomorrow. Well, actually, at this time of day, it is tomorrow, if you go east of the 100 degrees longitude. And I'm very happy to represent east of the 100 degrees longitude. It's only half the world's population, only half the world's GDP, and we're growing. And we want to keep growing like that. So let me talk on behalf of China. I don't often get the opportunity to do that. China went through the world's biggest ever fiscal stimulus in 2009, and it looks like it's been pretty successful. We never know for sure with China because they don't use necessarily the traditional market mechanisms, because you can't always trust the statistics, because there's any number of views about China. We know there's uncertainty about our conclusions, but we think they have engineered a successful soft landing where growth has fallen to, if you can call it fallen to 8%, and where it will probably continue in that sort of range. But of course, that's very important for us all in the region now, because our locus of economic power and focus, at least from our point of view in New Zealand, has moved from London in the 1960s to New York, Washington for the next 50 years, and it's now somewhere between Singapore and Shanghai. And that's true for that whole region. We do depend very much on China growth, and in some quite direct ways, but also in some quite complicated ways, through the intricate network of intra-industry trade that's now found through the East Asian and Australasian and Pacific region. So are we worried about Europe? Absolutely. But most important is how East Asian growth goes. And at the moment, it still looks like one of the few areas of the world that is maintaining pre-global financial crisis growth trends. Of course, the big thing for us is that we're seeing massive changes in prices since the global financial crisis. We're seeing inflation in the region dropped considerably. We're seeing the price of capital dropped hugely. So that, for example, many countries are now have interest rates that are far below what they have ever had historically. That's true for us. Actually, it's true for the United Kingdom, which has a very useful data set going back about 350 years, and we've now got the lowest rates in government gilts that has ever been recorded in that period. If you want to lend money to the Swiss government at the minute, you have to pay them for the pleasure of doing that. It's negative. That just changes the whole regime that we're operating in. There's other big price movements as well. While the price of capital has come down, the price of risk has gone up very significantly. And that's why in the East Asian, Australasian region, we want to be considered as good economies with low pricing on risk. But you've all seen what happens in the European scene with the massive pricing on risk that goes up in countries like Greece. And when it reaches a certain point, you simply can't borrow. The markets freeze up on you like that. But at the same time, we're actually seeing, ironically, a commodity price boom. And that's been there, again, a China and regional story, and it's a continuing one as well. We're seeing lots of other changes. We're seeing a lot of questioning around OECD countries about growth rates. They don't look like they were before the crisis. We're not sure we can get them back to what they were before the crisis. We think potential growth rates may have changed. We think output gaps may have changed. We think productivity might be significantly lower than what it was before. And in many of our countries, we're actually not worried about asset price booms and bubbles anymore. We've got other things on our mind. Balance sheet adjustments. People are much more cautious. Banks are much more cautious. Businesses are. They're all deleveraging at the moment. And indeed, the international balance of power is all changing as we go through this as well. Our other big marker in late 2008 was the G7 conference that met under emergency conditions and never bothered to issue a communique. Immediately after that, we had the first G20 conference. And if you want a moment when the world balance of power moved to take account of those fast-growing new BRIC countries, that was probably it. And for all of us, that's been a very big moment and it's got very big implications. I'll stop there. Thank you.